Welcome to Proven Sustainable Conversations, a collection of thought-provoking talks with Indigenous and Maroon people and their supporters to realize and challenge our conscious and unconscious colonized thinking and behaviors.
Okay, well, I will start with reading the lyrics of a John Trudell song that I am very, very moved to every time that I listen to it, and was listening to it repeatedly in recent days just because of some personal circumstances. It's his song Crazy Horse. It's from his album Bone Days that was released in 2000. These are the lyrics. Crazy horse, we hear what you say. One earth, one mother, one does not sell the earth the people walk upon. We are the land. How do we sell our mother? How do we sell the stars? How do we sell the air? Crazy horse, we hear what you say. Too many people standing their ground, standing the wrong ground. Predators face, he possessed a race. Possession a war that doesn't end. Children of God feed on children of earth. Days people don't care for people. These days are the hardest. Material fields, material harvest. Decoration on chains that binds, mirrors gold. The people lose their minds. Crazy horse, we hear what you say. One earth, one mother, one does not sell the earth the people walk upon. We are the land. Today is now and then. Dream smokes touch the clouds on a day when death didn't die. Real world time tricks shadows lie. Red, white, perception, deception. Predator tries civilizing us, but the tribes will not go without return. Genetic light from the other side, a song from the heart, our hearts to give. The wild days, the glory days live. Crazy horse, we hear what you say. One earth, one mother, one does not sell the earth the people walk upon. We are the land. How do we sell our mother? How do we sell the stars? How do we sell the air? Crazy horse, we hear what you say. Crazy horse, we hear what you say. We are the seventh generation. We are the seventh generation.
Ooh, wow. Thank you. Thank you, Dahr, for that wonderful introduction to this conversation with you. I'm K2 Oladuwa, and I am here with my colleague, Kelsey Green, and we are in conversation with Dahr Jamail. And Dahr is a well-known, respected human being, activist, journalist, witness, who comes out of Houston, Texas, and has traveled the world witnessing for those of us who couldn't make those journeys. And Dahr, we really are really happy and thankful that you are here with us today.
Well, thank you, K2, and Kelsey, thank you both for having me. It's a real honor to be with you.
Let's begin, Dahr, where you began. Many of the interviews that I have seen with you jump right into the briar patch. Let's start with home base. Houston was home for you. But before I go to Houston, I have to go to identity. Dahr Jamail. Is there a meaning to the name?
Yeah, good question. Thank you. And I really appreciate you starting at the beginning. Important place to start, right?
Yeah.
So it is a Lebanese name. I am Arab American. I have Lebanese blood on my father's side, but like so many of us here, my mom's German Irish, so my middle name is Kelly. That's her maiden name. And but Dahr, Dahr, is I had to go to the Middle East to learn how to pronounce my name the right way. It's Dahr is the proper pronunciation, and my last name Jamail, actually the real pronunciation is Jamail, and so it's a Lebanese name.
Okay, okay. And you grew up in Houston. Um, tell us about your background. Talk about your youth.
Yeah, so I grew up in Houston. One of three kids, the youngest. I have an older brother and sister. Uh, we were raised, my dad was a grocer, had a grocery store, worked for his dad who had one, and then ended up branching out and starting his own. And kind of a typical middle class family, I guess. And wasn't really in touch with politics and such. There was enough privilege there that didn't really have to be, so I thought, and wasn't really raised to be very politically engaged. Had that kind of cushion, and was raised Catholic, conservative down in Houston, kind of more of a product almost of the geography than anything else. Of that's just kind of how it was, you know. And I will talk about that political aspect of it, or lack thereof, because that played a big role in me becoming politicized later in life, and why I got very passionate about those political beliefs once they finally develop. Sort of a reaction against being raised without them, and kind of that privileged ignorance of thinking I didn't really need to worry about that kind of stuff because it didn't really affect me, you know? So I thought. But that said, all of our basic physical needs were attended to. I was able to go to college and such, and but it was a pretty sheltered, I would say, upbringing, and insofar as, you know, I didn't have to contend with and deal with things that the majority of the people on the planet do, you know. And so I would say I grew up in a bit of a bubble, and I don't blame my parents for that so much, because they were doing essentially what the life the way they were raised as well. But it's kind of this weird bubble in the South that I think both of you are probably familiar with, where that's just how it is and you don't question it, right? And if you question it, then there's something wrong with you.
So you're second generation or third generation?
Personally, I'm fourth. Yeah, my
Oh,
dad's third. He's 50% Lebanese. I'm fourth. Yeah, and
okay,
I didn't actually go to Lebanon the first time until right before on my way over to going to Iraq the first time to report on the war.
okay. So you grew up as an American,
I did.
as a white American?
That's, yeah, I was raised with that identity. Yeah. And again, it really wasn't, I didn't really come to know my Arab American identity until I went, ironically, until I went to the Middle East the first time, and then kept going back for years.
Yeah. Okay. And one more question before I bring in my astute colleague. Um, before, no, when you graduated high school and were on your way to college, what did you know about the world? What were your assumptions and expectations about the world?
I didn't know a damn thing. I laughed because I was completely ignorant, oblivious, wasn't paying attention to much outside of what I thought was important or what I wanted to do. I ended up going to Texas A&M University only because that's where everyone else on my father's side of the family had went. I didn't even think about, well, maybe I shouldn't go into college right away. Maybe I should sit around first and go see some other things and think about what I want to do. I didn't think about any of that stuff. I just did, again, it was that programming of like, okay, go to high school, get out of high school, go right into college, which from my perspective today seems utterly insane. Or even consider maybe I don't want to go to college at all. None of these questions were even on the table. It was kind of do as you're told kind of thing. So I went there because that's where everybody else went, and I didn't question it. And then that put me in a heck of a position to where once I got to college, then I started to kind of sense something's not quite right. Maybe this isn't exactly what I want to be doing or where I want to be.
Was there a field of study that you went to college for, or did you just go to college because that was the thing to do?
The latter. Yeah. I didn't go, I'm going to choose this specific school because this is what I want to do. There wasn't any of that, which, when I look back now, that's just utterly absurd to go spend that kind of money and go to college and that kind of time to pursue something that you don't even. So I was in general studies for my first 2.5 years. I didn't leave that until I was forced to declare a major. So I ended up graduating with a major in speech communications, which thankfully serves me very, very well now, given the line of work I ultimately kind of fell into by life circumstances. And then I minored in philosophy, psychology, and sociology just because that's how many times I changed majors.
Okay. Kelsey?
Yeah. Did you grow up in a urban, suburban, or rural community within Texas? And I'm asking that to understand, we've already mentioned you going to Middle East, and I know as this conversation unfolds, there have been many places that you've visited and lived. And so I'm wondering also about that connection to land and nature and resources, and whether you had any personal connection through the activities or family traditions or rituals in Texas or into college that were really dear to you.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up because that's a really important part of my story. So I grew up in essentially suburban Houston, fairly close to downtown. Now it might even be probably considered more part of downtown, given how things have grown, but definitely suburban, in the city very much. So if my parents hadn't regularly taken us to Galveston, to spend time down there on the beach and in the waters there and fishing and crabbing and things, as well as up into the hill country of Texas, to a lake there for an annual family vacation, as well as having two different uncles. One of them I just got back from visiting in Houston, my uncle Edward, who made it a point to, when I graduated high school and then again when I graduated college, took me out to basically see the world and introduce me to not just different places to see, hey, there's countries out there outside of the United States, and go taste them and experience them firsthand, but also just different ideas, different ways of thinking, and he exposed me to that, and it really planted the seeds that would later sprout and change my life. And then I had another uncle, my uncle Jimmy, who's left the planet back in 2001, who took me into the mountains of Wyoming and in the Dakotas and Montana for camping trips. And that exposed me to the mountains, which also would play and continues to play a huge factor in my life, of always really, really wanting and needing to have a strong connection to the land and the outdoors wherever it is that I live. And I would say that because of those things together, most of the places I've lived in my life, I've moved there because of a draw from the land itself, of like, I need to be on that particular part of the planet.
Uh-huh. So there's been something moving within you your whole life that has guided you So, okay, in the mountains with your uncles, how did you recognize this affinity that you had, this attachment to the land that you had? Wasn't it an intellectual understanding that came out of your bodily experience? How did that develop?
No, it was great question. It was really more just love of just being in a place and being in awe and kind of being right sized by being in a place with grandeur, whether it was the Rocky Mountains or later on when I moved up to Alaska, of literally, just using Alaska as an example, the first time I went up there and being on the front end of Denali National Park and then hiking up a hill and then literally the clouds parting and seeing Denali for the first time. And it literally felt like this tractor beam on my heart of like, I need to be there, and it wasn't a conquest thing. It was it was like, that is a very, very special area. And I want to spend time up there. I need to. And literally moving up to that state at one point only for that reason. It was like, commit to living there and then I'll figure out where to live and a job and all that. That's less important than just being up in that place.
Wow. So, did you go to Alaska to Denali out of college?
No, so I graduated. I'll just say that I had a spiritual awakening in college and realized I needed to not live, stay there. I needed to not stay in that place, and I had no interest in doing like continuing that program that brought me into college of like, okay, now you're going to graduate, now go get a job, now go get material things and a house, etc.
Mm-hmm.
And that repulsed me, in fact. And I had a friend that I had grown up with who lived in the Rocky Mountains. He was actually at Colorado State, and I was like, well, I'll just go get a job at a ski resort so that way I'll at least be up in the mountains. And so it started really a series of service jobs of just, okay, I was in the Rocky Mountains, um, making barely above minimum wage, but I was where I wanted to be, and I could go hiking and spend time off up in the mountains. And then circuitously just kind of went from service job to service job. And then found my way. I had a job out on a place called Johnston Island, which is a U.S. territory about 800 miles southwest of Oahu. I ended up working out there as a lab technician for a company called Southwest Research Institute that did uh, chemical uh, chemical weapons testing. It's not testing, but essentially there was a chemical demilitarization facility where they were literally, there was a plant set up out there, contracted by Raytheon, interestingly, that was incinerating leftover nerve gas, mustard gas from World War II and earlier wars. And so I worked for a company that did the air monitoring of that plant. And so I worked out there for a couple of years. And I think it was a direct, inadvertent first taste of the military industrial complex of, this is insane. This is a waste. The corruption I saw. And I literally moved from there up to Alaska. It was literally a run for the hills situation. Well, I don't want any part of this. So so from there I ended up going up to Alaska, and then that's where I lived. And then so like I mentioned earlier, I had moved up there to mountain climb and be up on Denali, and would figure out the job later. And then so I was looking for jobs, and I saw an ad in the paper, and it said quadriplegic man needs personal assistant, must be willing to travel. And so I thought, well, that looks interesting. I'd done a little bit of independent living assistance as a job before. And I went up, so I went and met him, and his name was Dwayne French, and he was the director of the state of Alaska Division of Vocational Rehabilitation. So he, as a quadriplegic with an electric wheelchair, that very, very limited mobility. His job was to help other people with disabilities get and keep their jobs. And we met, and he had broken his neck when he was 14 years old in a diving accident in Nebraska. And we immediately hit it off, and I started working for him. And he was an extremely political person. At the time, Alaska, believe it or not, had a Democratic governor, and he was a Democratic appointee. Dwayne was. And so on day 3, which was a Friday, he said, "So what are your politics?" And I said, "Well, I guess I'm a Republican," right? Because that's how I was raised. And he got flustered, and he said, "So," he started challenging me. He said, "So what are their policies that you support? What are the policies of the Democrats that you oppose? And why aren't you a libertarian or an anarchist or a communist or any other party? Like, what are your thoughts on this?" And I got very flustered at that point because he exposed my raw ignorance. And I just said, well, whatever they do doesn't really affect us anyway. It doesn't matter." And I could tell he got very upset by that. And he said, "Okay." And, I'd only worked for him 3 days, but we really bonded because this guy exuded soul and passion about what he did and about life. And so he challenged me, and he said, "Okay, well, if you really believe what the government doesn't affect us, and whatever your personal politics are don't matter, think about this. So the Alaska legislature is trying to pass a bill, and if it goes through, I'll lose the funding I get to have a weekend personal attendant." And, this is someone who can't get in or out of their wheelchair, do many other things on their own. And he said, "So what I want you to do is, when you go home tonight, Friday, when you go to sleep, I want you to then stay in bed until Monday morning. Somewhere around the middle of the day, Saturday, you'll be laying in your own piss and shit, and you're going to stay that way until Monday morning, at which point I want you to call me and tell me that what they do doesn't affect us." And I felt about that big. And so I got very humbled by what he said, and fortunately had at least enough humility to kind of sit back and say, "Okay, I'm listening," and that really started my political education, because he made me start thinking. He started challenging me on my ignorance when it arose, which was often. And we would just I would go over there in the mornings at 5:30 to help him get up and prepare for the day, and we would listen to NPR and talk. And then I got to travel around with him and see what he, as a person with a major disability, got to be confronted with, and what he had to overcome on a daily basis just to live in the world. And it was a real education. And and I loved him. I think that's the other core component of this story, is that here was this person that I loved already deeply, and I saw something affecting him, and something that was going to potentially dramatically affect him, and it was directly from the government. And so that was the lesson: is you cannot not be engaged. You have to.
So Dwayne French was the person who provided you with your PhD.
Thank you. Very
Yeah.
accurate. That's right.
Yes. And that tapping into that humility that you could see in yourself as a result of your ignorance, where does that show up again in your relationship with Denali and the Iraq War? Because you were at this point in your life in such an advanced state of learning. You had opened your heart and your soul to someone who was filling you up with information. And that
Mm-hmm.
information you were taking in and processing it with the news that you were getting about this war that was happening in the Middle East?
Right. So while I'm coming up to speed politically, and I started reading and tracking the news and educating myself on US foreign policy, and all of this is going on. And it's interesting because I became very internationally focused, and I would later become more nationally focused. But I started with international, and I think part of that's because I had been on a mountaineering trip in the Himalayas and to a peak called Broad Peak nearby K2, and we finished the trip and then had a little extra time. And this is right before September 11, 2001. And me and a few of my buddies stuck around, and we went up to the border of Afghanistan, and right up above, went through a town called Peshawar and up to the border. And then I picked up a copy of a book called Reaping the Whirlwind in Islamabad and read it on their way back to Anchorage, Alaska. And it was about Reagan's policy in Afghanistan while it was being occupied by the Russians, and sort of the creation of the Taliban and teaching them terrorist actions and how to make car bombs and human bombs and things like this. And I read that on the way home, getting very educated of like, hey, this whole situation doesn't look the way it does without very heavy US involvement. I land, and a month later, boom, 9/11. So I was having these like real-time events happening right about what I was being educated about, right? And it was just like, that was one, probably the biggest example, but there were many, many others. And then and I had been reading about Iraq and the sanctions, and right around then, right after the US starts bombing the hell out of Afghanistan, Donald Rumsfeld starts talking about Iraq and Saddam Hussein. And I'm like, wait, hang on, this is insane. And I'm already tracking international media and then seeing the propaganda in the United States. And it was like, something in me was like, this is so egregiously obvious. Why aren't other people just going crazy about this? And at the same time, this is against the backdrop of having just watched and learned more about Dwayne, who has a person with this, pretty extreme physical disability, who could only get around in an electric wheelchair with partial use of his arms. Yet I knew that he had gone and had his attendants in the late 1980s chaining him in his chair to buses in Washington, D.C. to help basically force the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And him talking about them getting, one of the actions they did of all the attendants getting people, the high level quads, getting them out of their chairs and laying them on outside the office of a particular senator that wasn't going to vote for the ADA, and them out there chanting and, like this kind of stuff. And it was like, and so I think having all of that in my consciousness, and then knowing, taking Dwayne into work every day, and his hero was MLK, and had, a statue of him literally on his desk, and always talking about him. And we'd always listen to his speeches on MLK Day and all of that. And then burgeoning up inside of me is Iraq and my outrage. And then as the war went on, I was just talking to Dwayne about it, because by then I wasn't working for him, but we were living together. And I was talking to him about it, and something was like, I think maybe I should go over there and write about what's going on, because the coverage is just, the media coverage is why this is happening. And he just said, if you feel that strongly about it, then you should go. You should put your money where your mouth is. So that's how all that together really coalesced.
Wow. Wow. Kelsey?
That's just the conversation has flowed in such a way. I appreciate the stories have flowed like one to the other to really give us such depth on who you are and your perspective and the choices that you've made, what's informed that, both person, place, and experiences, books, all of it. I guess that leads us to, at this point now, yeah, your experience then in Iraq. So you go over there to report on it. If you could start sharing your presence there and what you witnessed, how that changed or continue to expand or evolve your perspectives, the way you were making sense of yourself in the world. That's yeah, we'll just keep going with this narration that you're sharing. It's been very powerful and informative.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, so I go to Iraq. I had no idea what I was doing. I literally just threw myself into it. I was like, well, I'm going to figure out how to go. So I found a way to get in a particular hotel to go into. And fortunately, I went in November 2003, in that it was 6 months, no, yeah, about 6 months after Baghdad fell to the Americans. And so everything hadn't gone completely crazy yet. Like, it was still relatively safe to go in and walk down the street and not have to hide my identity as an American. And so there was some room for error, which was good because there were errors. But it's kind of one of those deals where you make the path by walking it, because I was on my way in and I was in a hotel in Jordan. I was going to stay at the Palestine hotel. I just happened to be sitting at the one other computer, and it's a tiny little cheapo backpacker hotel, next to a guy named James Longley, who's a filmmaker who actually made a great documentary called Iraq in Fragments, which was nominated for Best Documentary in 2006. It lost to Gore's climate film. But he was coming out and he said, well, if you're going in, you probably need an interpreter, right? And I'm like, of course I do. I was just going to figure that out once I got in there. And he's like, well, use mine. I'm going out. I've got to go to this film fest in Russia. So that's how I found my first interpreter. And so I write Ahmed, and then he meets me at the hotel when I get in the next day. And so things like that, all these serendipities just kept happening. But I got in and I was on a mission to really show how the war was affecting the Iraqi people. It was a sort of self-appointed goal to try to fill that need, that glaring omission by the corporate media in the United States. It was all about the troops and liberation and all this, and it wasn't about, a war that would go on to kill more than a million Iraqi people and displace millions more. So me and Ahmed would just get up in the morning and go out, and he'd hear stories. Hey, this person in my neighborhood, their home just got raided by the Americans. And we already knew like bad shit was going down in Abu Ghraib. There was torture. There was a lot of horrible things. And this is in November, early December 2003. The Abu Ghraib story wouldn't break until April 2004. But if you're just on the street talking to people, you knew this was what was going on, because the people always know what's going on. And so we started reporting about home raids, going into hospitals and reporting about, oh, this little kid was just shot by Americans, and this guy's wife got disappeared and they don't know where she is. And, started doing stories like that. And I was just writing I was writing emails and sending them back mostly to people in the United States. And then eventually started publishing on a little free website. And then from there started getting picked up to do freelance journalism. And that's how my career started. But I basically, back directly to your question, I got directly exposed to, on a daily basis, what empire does, like the dominant culture and the capitalist system and white supremacy, all that whole project. Like, this is what it costs people. And I had to go to Iraq and see it there first before, I think Dwayne prepared me for it some, but I had to go there to see it. And then that would actually set the stage to later come back here and see it, starting with how Black people and indigenous people, and it's been going on here forever. But I had to go to Iraq to kind of dive into it first.
Let me jump in to that and back it up. Was it anger that took you to Iraq? What was the emotion, the sentiment, the feeling that took you to Iraq, that put you in harm's way? And second part of that question, what was your intellectual and emotional relationship with America when you went?
It was anger, and also I really, really felt a lot of solidarity and compassion for the Iraqi people, knowing what the sanctions had done. Had killed over 500,000 kids. What those had done, I had this, and it's funny because it didn't really. I don't know how much of it's attributable to being Arab American. I didn't really see it that way. I just saw it as a human to human thing. I knew enough to know how much these people had already suffered, and now this war is being forced upon them that they didn't ask for, didn't want any part of. So there was great compassion, and then alongside tremendous anger towards the government of my country. And I felt like one thing I can do is just go write about it. So that's what ultimately drew me in. And then when I got in there and started seeing firsthand what was happening, of the tremendous human loss, seeing the bodies, seeing little kids and women shot, seeing people detained, knowing what was going on in those torture facilities, and seeing all of that, it was like, this is that lifestyle that we have back in the States. This is what it generates, and this is what it costs. And I got to see that every day that I was over there, off and on, for the next 10 years.
So that's where the witness was born.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So as that witness, how did you understand the resistance that was coming and it was building because of empire's footprint there?
The resistance in Iraq specifically?
Yes.
Yeah, it was natural. I thought it was a good thing. I thought, these people had absolutely every right to defend themselves and their country from the invader. And if I were in their shoes, I would have done the same thing. Who wouldn't? I would like to say anybody with a moral compass and a backbone would stand up to that sort of thing, especially if your home was literally being raided directly and horrible things happening and being done to the people that you loved, let alone just the egregiousness of the propaganda and the lies of like, oh, we're going to rebuild Iraq and, modernize it and all this, which was, there was no electricity, there was no water, there was no security, there was still not enough food. There was, in fact, for so many people, things were far worse after the invasion than before. And that's, so yeah, speaking to the resistance, and knowing where it came from, like Fallujah is the perfect example. This was a place where people hated Saddam. Americans were actually welcomed to Fallujah once they overthrew Saddam in Baghdad, because he was so reviled in Fallujah and in that part of Iraq. And yet the Americans came in, occupied a school. People asked them to leave the school. They needed it for their kids. Americans, of course, didn't leave. Protests started happening. And how did the military respond? They started killing the protesters. And so hence the resistance was born in Fallujah. And that's kind of a microcosm of what happened in much of the country. And all you have to do is put yourself in those people's shoes and think, well, of course this would happen. I would have done the same thing, right? So if you talk about resistance, of course there's going to be resistance, and they were heavily respected by many Iraqis.
Yes. You were there for a decade?
I was in and out of there for a decade. Yeah, over a lot of my trips were very heavily around 2003, 4, and 5, and by 2006 it became extremely dangerous to work in there, not just for me, but for any Iraqi working with me, especially for them, I would say. And so I then covered the occupation largely from covering the refugee crisis in Jordan and Syria, because so many Iraqis were going out to there. And then I was able to go back in again in 2009, and then a couple more times when I was working for Al Jazeera in 2011 and 2013.
How the reporting that you did, the on the ground reporting that you did in Iraq, how was it received here in the States? How was your work being interpreted here in the States?
Well, the other I word I would use would be it was largely ignored instead of interpreted. Of course, corporate media wouldn't touch me with a 10-foot pole. So my work was very welcome and heavily uh, supported by the left-wing press. So like Democracy Now, I kind of became almost a de facto correspondent for them. I was freelancing the entire time. A small independent news site started up. It no longer exists, but I started writing for them real heavily. But I was writing freelance in other countries around the world, sometimes for more mainstream publications. I mean, my first paid work was radio work for BBC World Service.
Hmm.
And then I wrote for The Independent, I wrote for The Guardian, I wrote for the Sunday Herald in Scotland, other publications around the world. But in the US, the only place where I could have my reporting covered or do radio for was Lefty Media.
Okay. When you got back here, what shape were you in?
Ha! Um, I was a mess. I got back, and again, keep in mind that my political education is now, of course, still happening at warp speed, but still, I'm still learning a lot about how things work, realpolitik, empire, how it affects the world, how it affects people back in the US, all of that propaganda. But I came back and I had severe PTSD. By the end of my second trip, I had been shot at. I'd been near car bombs. I'd walked through morgues, smelled the bodies, watched children die. I mean, I had all kinds of really severe trauma, including all the secondary trauma that I would later learn that you get from interviewing people who all this sort of thing had happened to. Um, so I was like the classic combat vet. You come back, you can feel nothing but either numbness or rage. And so I was enraged at the Bush administration. I felt that all of them should be hanging from light poles and nothing less of that would serve. And I had horrific slides of what I had seen in Fallujah and around Baghdad. And so I would come back to the States and do these Iraq talks that were essentially slideshows of horrific slides. I was basically trying to grab people's faces and just shove the information at them, which I would later learn there's better ways to go about that. But that's where I was at. And, God help you if you came to one of my shows. But that's the best I could do. But I was very, very, very angry. I would say I was, in that part of the 5 stages of grief. I was definitely stuck for years in uh, great anger.
Kelsey, I'm gonna bring you back in after this question. Um, who is Joanna Macy? Joanna Macy.
Joanna Macy is, I believe she's 95 or 96 years old now. She lives in Berkeley. She's a Buddhist systems theorist, deep ecologist, and she and her late husband, Fran Macy, developed a grief work process called the work that reconnects. It essentially brings together people, whether it be, you know, journalists on the front lines like myself, or artists or writers or other people who are experiencing deep grief for what they see happening in the world, wherever that is, here in the United States or abroad. And you get together and you, whether it's over a day or a few days, or in my case, 10 days in a workshop I did with Joanna in 2006, and you do these exercises and it basically brings the grief out of you. And so, excuse me, I can say that Joanna Macy probably saved my life, because in 2006, she invited me to one of her workshops. And that's when the first time I could cry and really experience the heartbreak and the sadness that was really largely what was below that rage, was just the deep, deep sadness that I was feeling for everything that I had seen. And so I came into this intensive, and the first 2 days was kind of sitting there like this. And then by about the third day, we did this one exercise and it just broke me open. And I started crying so much, I basically didn't stop for the next week. And to the point where Joanna started calling me her little faucet.
Kelsey.
Oh, wow. I hear lots of threads between power of the emotions and relationships with these distinct individuals that are showing up, the relationship with places, and the deep empathy that's been formed, and the curiosity that's pulled through. And I'm wondering, to extract this, thinking of our listeners too, and we're currently in a time of ongoing, of course, empire still exists, and the ramifications of colonization and climate crisis are continuing to unfold, and see more and more profound examples of that around the world. And I just wondering if there are any even brief practices that you do on a daily basis, or in times of overwhelm, that you would want to share with those listening. Or again, even if it's, you've mentioned Joanna Macy's resources and others, and the books that you've read, which of course we can share links to as well. But I think it's always great to find this balance between, or trying to keep thinking the bigger picture, bigger understanding these systems, and then how you're dealing with that and continuing to evolve in a deep way over time. But what are those also learnings that you're gleaning and finding yourself recalling and putting into practice for, quite frankly, some sanity on, again, more moment to moment circumstances?
Gosh, that's a really good question. We could spend an hour unpacking just that, right? But I think a short answer would be, I've learned the importance of gratitude, especially having worked in places like Iraq. And actually, I was in South Lebanon in the 2006 Hezbollah-Lebanon war, which this one's, of course, far eclipsing. But so know the importance of, and how fortunate I am just to live in a place where I don't have to worry about a bomb coming through the ceiling right here. I have food, I have water, I have clean air to breathe, just like a daily gratitude practice. I have a friend actually that every morning we just text each other 3 things that we're grateful for. And we started it like 3 years ago and rarely miss a day. A direct connection to spirit. A lot of people, especially on the left, are a little afraid to maybe talk about that, but it's part of my life, direct connection and having a practice with spirit. And I'm not talking about organized religion. I'm talking about a spiritual practice of some sort. It's really important. It's what's really important. It's baseline for me. And then, having people to talk about what's going on with. I mean, that was one of the things that saved my bacon with my PTSD. Was a good friend of mine, Mike Ferner, who was off and on president of Veterans for Peace for a long time, took one look at me when I was in that rage spot and said, Bubs, you better find someone to talk to or you're in being big trouble. So talking about what's going on, and then also, and this obviously comes from a place of privilege of all of us not living in a war zone right now, of guard your senses. I learned that from my partner, who's a trauma therapist, of I can't intake the amount of news that I did when I was a working journalist for 19 years, of like reading this stuff for hours. I cannot take that stuff in my mind and my heart and think I'm going to stay sane. I have to limit that intake. I have to guard my sense. We have to guard our senses because no one else will but us. We're the only ones that can do that for ourselves, right? So I can't sit around and read the news the way I used to. That isn't to say I'm oblivious to what's going on. I scan the headlines, I pay attention, but then I'm also very focused on, okay, what can I do to help? And I am very fortunate that I have a job where I can do direct work that helps people and helps people who are doing really, really good work for the planet. And I think no matter where we are in our lives, we all can find something that we can do to help, and that I need to focus on that. I know what the problem is, and it's, do I want to focus on the problem most of my waking hours, or what I can do? And so those are some of the real tangible things that I can offer up that have really saved my bacon, And the other thing, if I can riff off that, and I think this might get into some of the other things we're going to talk about, is, I one of the other things that helped me was a man named Stan Rushworth, who has he was in the Vietnam theater. He's a veteran. Also took me under his wing and introduced me to a very, very close friend of his, a man named Harold Dick Jr., who's Apache's Poor Sweat, and they did something akin to like a veteran sweat with me. Harold's a Vietnam veteran also, and that sweat lodge with them, it caused some very tectonic shifts within me, but also kind of brought me more into an Indigenous perspective. I would go on to co-author a book with Stan, co-edit a book where we would interview 20 different Indigenous people about what they're doing today in response to the everything crisis. And by way of talking with Stan on a weekly, sometimes daily basis, and working on this book and interviewing all these people who had survived genocide, have to live with the ongoing erasure, prejudice, discrimination, all the things. And each one of them was doing really amazing work in their own ways for the planet. And in that process, realizing, who am I to sit around? I haven't had to survive a genocide. I haven't been through everything they've been through. Am I going to sit around and piss and moan about the state of things, or am I going to find something to do about it? And that was a transformative experience to me, of like, I just need to get busy. I got to find something I can do to contribute that's positive, and not sit around and just talk about and point at the problem.
Part of that, doing something that was going to do something about making this a better planet, was your reporting on the Gulf crisis and your reporting on the climate emergency that moved into your field of indigeneity, into your relationship with indigeneity. How is that evolving in your life now, as in the work that you have now?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I mean, I mentioned Galveston as a youth at the very beginning of our conversation. And so when the BP oil disaster happened in 2010, I took that very personally, right? Because that the Gulf of Mexico is very important to me personally. I care about it. The best memories of my youth were down there. So when that happened, I got similar to Iraq. I got very angry at BP. What can I do? By then, I was already an established journalist, and so I went down there and started writing about it. And then again, another layer of empire, right? Here's this giant oil company causing an oil disaster, the Iraq War, all about oil, the climate crisis, oil's a giant component, obviously. So, right, it's all the same thing. It's all the same war and it's all the same system. And I think, I shifted from my coverage of the BP oil disaster into the climate theater and then covered that real heavily for 10 years and then wrote a book on it. And that book is what led me to a point of personal crisis of understanding the depth and the gravity of our situation, that all these feedback loops have kicked in. There's already so much heat baked into the system, no matter what we do. Like, we are in a very severe crisis and it's only going to keep intensifying. And here we are talking while wars raging in the Middle East and expanding. We talked right before we came online, Kelsey's literally in the aftermath of the path of a massive hurricane. I mean, we're in it, and that all of that together kind of led me to this point of crisis where I was in a dark night of the soul for several years of not knowing what to do, but understanding how much trouble we're in. And it was right in that period, towards the end of it, when I was introduced to my friend Stan that I mentioned. And then this whole different perspective was brought in, because what happened was Stan was coming to my book talks for my climate book, which was called The End of Ice, Bearing Witness and Finding Meaning in the Path of Climate Disruption. And he was seeing all the despair in the audience. And he said, mostly white people. And he said, these folks need to listen to what Indigenous people have to say, because we've already been through an apocalypse. And we started talking, and then that's where the idea of he and I's book, We Are the Middle of Forever, was born. And it's that total perspective shift of, we're all part of the earth. And, that indigeneity piece, K2, that you bring up, we're all together. We're all part of the earth. All of the parts of earth are parts of us, and we need to behave accordingly. And it literally shifted how I start to see the world. I just got back recently from a trip to Alaska, interviewing Tlingit and Haida people up there, that Home Planet Fund, who I work for now, that we work with. And there's this great quote, this woman, Marina Anderson, she's Tlingit and Haida, and we were walking around in the Tongass forest together, the largest intact temperate rainforest left on Earth. And she was talking about this topic, and she says, the trees, the rocks, the fish, the bear, all of them carry spirit just like us. And the trees, the rock, the bears, the fish, the only difference between them and myself is that I can type. Right. So it's just a complete different perspective shift, that when I really think about that and really think deeply about what that means, then I'm going to walk very differently on the earth.
It's obvious to me, listening to your story, that you've been led by spirit to the place that you are today. That there are no coincidences. They're just crossroads. And at those crossroads, we make different choices. And the choices that you have made to witness what you have and be able to communicate what you have is clearly a spiritual path. So finding you today in in the bosom of indigenous folk leading a effort of support and reclamation. It seemed from my old person's perspective seems very natural. What are you seeing? What types of adaptation are you seeing that those of us who don't have your range of experience need to know? Because all we hear is the disaster. But there are people
Yeah.
all over the world who are doing the work of the planet, who are doing the earth's work, the crazy horse work. What are you what examples can you give us of people who are doing what needs to be done for all of us?
Yeah, thank you, K2. And I want to preface that by just acknowledging that you're one of those people, knowing you're just the part of your story of being sentenced to something you didn't do and spending years of your life on death row and going through that and surviving it and coming out of it and doing what you do is yet another example of exactly what I'm talking about. Like, knowing someone like you, having gone through that, what place would I or anyone else have to sit around and just twiddle our thumbs and whine about, injustice and how bad everything is and not finding something to do about it. So I want to start with that example. And I know that you don't need this and may not even want that, acknowledgement, but I want to acknowledge it because it's a very important, huge example and a profound one, I think. So going from that into, I mentioned I just got back from Alaska and Southeast Alaska. And again, these are indigenous people that my organization works with up there. And I went up there to literally just write about what they're doing that is working exactly what your question is towards. And so I got to spend, I haven't written about this yet. It actually might be one of the next things I write about. There's a village called Kake, Alaska, Kake, and it's about an hour seaplane flight southwest of Juneau. And it's on a big island, and it's a tiny little village, 500 people, in 90% indigenous, kind of stereotypically big problems with alcohol and drugs, uh, big suicide problem, because these are people in a culture that have been living under the aftermath of genocide and ongoing occupation for forever, and so the president of it's called the Organized Village of Cake is what that tribe calls itself. The president is this man named Joel Jackson, and I got to spend a day with Joel and go out to the other side of the island where the tribe is basically reclaiming possession of an old Forest Service bunkhouse. And he said he showed me how he walked in there the first time and said, "This is our healing center. We're going to turn this into a healing center." And he is now, they've received some funding, they're going to get more, and his vision is, we're going to use our culture, we're going to bring people out here from the village who are drug addicts and alcoholics, and we're going to use our ways, our prayers, our ceremony, our ways of hunting and fishing, and we're going to use our culture to heal these people because we know what they've been made sick by. And I thought that was profound. And then I went on later in the trip to Juneau, and I met a woman who is a regional healer working with people like Joel directly on that project and coordinating other healing activities around all of Southeast Alaska. So that's happening literally as we speak. There's also a native food sovereignty movement happening because in these villages where shipping things in is so expensive and buying food in the small stores in these villages, like there's a bag of rice for $90, like this kind of thing. It's untenable. And yet they're they always have been, but there's a huge uptake in their subsistence lifestyles of harvesting their own fish, harvesting moose, harvesting deer, sharing it with elders, sharing it within the village. The resumption of these Tlingit potato gardens. Literally, it's a type of potato that has never seen European soil, and planting them in certain areas alongside beaches, using dried seafood as compost. And then a lot of the youth are involved in growing these potatoes, which then are then brought back to the village to provide for the elderly. Things like proxy hunters. You can sign up as a youth. You don't have to be Indigenous, but sign up, become a proxy hunter, get this elder person's permit, go take the deer for them and bring them the meat. Like this kind of thing is happening all across Southeast Alaska right now.
Okay. Wow. That's powerful. It talks about, it talks about, it's so clear. It talks about the relationship as the healing modality for what ails us. We have to be in relationship with one another so that we are in, and reminding ourselves that we are in relationship with the earth on an ongoing basis. And we can't get away from that no matter what our thinking minds tell us. You're okay. Africa rarely gets mentioned in corporate media, in the climate crisis, or in when indigenous people are spoken about. You're on your way to East Africa later this year. Who are you going to see, and what are you expecting to find?
Yeah, thank you for that and bringing that in to the conversation. So, my organization that I work for, Home Planet Fund, we give grants to Indigenous and people in local communities around the world who are on the front lines of the climate and biodiversity crisis. And one of our initial grants went to several partners over in Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda who are pastoralists. Like the Maasai are probably the most well-known. There's several other groups, but that's the most well-known of our partners there. People who they're semi-nomadic, and they have for millennia been bringing their animals around, herding them around, moving around the earth in a natural really rhythm with the earth year round in a cycle. And we give them money to help basically maintain that lifestyle. And one of the key parts of that now is doing a thing of helping them protect access to the land, because there's so much infringement from private companies, rich people buying up the land just for themselves or their house, military camps, things like this. So we're helping them basically secure their tenured rights to the land that they use to maintain that lifestyle, because it's not just for them, but it's that lifestyle, exactly as you just said. That's a life, they're in symmetry with the earth. And so just to give people an idea of how it works, that just by doing what they do, moving their animals around that naturally till the land, fertilize the land, etc., that lifestyle, our partners in East Africa, along with other pastoralists around all of Africa, which I should say that roughly half the land of the entire continent of Africa is stewarded by pastoralists. That let me give you an idea of what the importance of that, just from a climate perspective, that each human being, we have about 8 kilos of carbon in our bodies. And so every year, just from pastoralism in Africa, they sequester the carbon equivalent of every human being on the planet every year. And so that's how important that is from just a climate perspective, not even talking about those people and their culture and the amazing importance that that life has just for biodiversity hotspots around Africa. You know, just like what you said, we always hear about the Amazon, right? When we talk about climate change, but in the Congo Basin is the second biggest rainforest on the planet. And we can't talk about that without talking about the people who steward it, which are the people who live in those parts of the African continent, right? Which we all know, okay, the Amazon's in big trouble. And what that means to the climate crisis if that goes away. Well, yeah, we need to talk about the second biggest rainforest in the world, which is in Africa. So that gives you an idea. So I'm going over there either this November or December to do storytelling with them. I am very, very humbled and fortunate to get to go out into the field with these folks. I'll go out with a local photographer and we will tell the stories about what they're doing and all of the good work that they're doing and the critical work that they're doing for the planet.
Kelsey?
Yes, and we are so appreciative of your powerful storytelling, which has been exemplified in this conversation today and through all of the pieces that we've been fortunate to start to dive into leading up to today's talk as well. I want to be conscious of time because I feel like we go on for days in talking about all of this. I think stemming from even that connection to the significance of elevating awareness of Africa and the synergized patterns across the globe when it comes to various people's views, efforts, and the issues as well. We here at Proven Sustainable have identified these threads and themes that are important for us. I want to take a moment to read these particular themes and terms that ring true in our work, and again, culminating the voices and the projects of Indigenous and Maroon peoples. And then hear if one of them resonates most with your life and work. And those terms are sustainability, endurance, resilience, freedom, resistance, sovereignty, and reparations. So does one of those speak more to you, or a select combination of those? Would love to hear your direct feedback.
Gosh, all of them. Yeah, they're all kind of the same thing. And, you know, gosh, resilience and endurance and resistance. I think just by enduring, you know, people, whether you're Indigenous or, you know, whatever your heritage is, I think just by adhering to work that's for and with the planet, right? And when I say that, I mean not just, you know, geography, but all life, you know, and not just humans and not just plants and animals, but all life and all of the earth. I think that if we are engaged in that kind of work, then that is resistance to empire, you know, the materialist, ever expanding, consumer-based, profit-based, expanding empire and everything that entails and everything that comes with it. The best way to resist that is to focus on the good and focus on doing good work, you know, putting my energy into good work for the planet. And so that is the resistance, that is the endurance, that is what builds resilience. And by doing that, I may meet people like both of you and Socks and others that are doing that work. You know, it's like the path's made by walking it, right? Do the work, and then I get what I need to continue to do that work in the form of um, having enough money for food and a place to live, and meeting the right people to do the right kind of work, to get information out to people who are ready to hear it. All of that just starts to happen when we really are walking in a good path, on a good path for the earth. I mean, that's certainly been my experience, because none of this was by design. Like, I didn't wake up and I didn't move up to Alaska in 1996 and think, oh, hey, yeah, well, I see myself in, 25 years working for Home Planet Fund. Like, it just didn't go that way. I never intended to go to a war zone. I never intended to meet the people that I did. It's just, that's everything that happened out of really a desire to be closer to the planet, I would say.
Just one parting question. No, two parting questions. The first one, the first one is, when you get back from Africa, let's be in touch, because we would like to have a conversation with you again about the specifics of climate and resistance and resilience on the continent that never gets spoken about. Second question, in this incredible gift for storytelling that you have, when you engage people and communities, do you tell them your story?
Thank you. Well, to your first point, I can't wait to have that conversation with you after I get back. And secondly, the great thing, one of the many great things about my work today with Home Planet Fund is I get to go hang out with these folks, and it does come up. I mean, we're running around looking at things together, and sometimes have days with our partners in the field, and we become friends. And yeah, so it gets personal, and these stories come up, and not obviously, we usually don't have the time to sit around and have an hour and a half conversation, but yeah, bits and pieces come up, which is good, right? Because that's how we get to know each other and build trust.
Like you said, we cut the path by walking it. We cut the path by walking it. Thank you, Dahr, for this incredible conversation, for the breathtaking, mind-numbing work that you do, and for your witnessing for us here in the Empire. We need somebody who sees clearly and can speak clearly to what it is they see, and you obviously do that. Thank you so very much for this conversation.
Well, thank you, Kate, too, and thank you, Kelsey. Thank you both. It's been absolutely fabulous, and thanks largely to y'all's brilliant questions. I mean, many of them I've never been asked before, and certainly not in the way that both of you did. So thank you, and thank you for your work. And I'm really grateful to be friends, and look forward to talking a lot more, especially when I get back from that trip.
Yeah.
Thank you. And one last space holder, is there any way that this conversation, our listeners and growing network and community, can support you and your work and those that you want to support? Anything you want to speak to, and then we're happy to again include references, links, and all of that in writing too.
Yeah, I think the folks where I work now, Home Planet Fund, the website is homeplanetfund.org. The most important thing is just have a look, read about our partners, go to the update section, start reading the stories I'm starting to post from the field, and spread the word. I think that's the important thing. Sign up for our listserv. It's all free. If you feel moved to donate, great. If not, have a read, spread the word. I think that's it, because we're working all around the world, and we're supporting people doing what I feel is some of the most important work that could be done today.
Thank you.
We hope you found this conversation insightful and thought-provoking. Please like and follow the Proven Sustainable podcast to spread the word, and stay tuned for more engaging dialogues. Additional information and resources are available within the episode description and online at provensustainable.org.